All right, so I'm going to be doing form validation with htmx today. We're going to start off with just a Web 1.0 plain HTML form. We've got our fake dating site here. It's got 5 validated fields, 14 different validation rules. The final product is going to be, HTMX only. We're not using any other front end stuff. So that means that the server validation, we're going to basically use the exact same validation that we use on the server with our HTMX. So no duplication. That means you can trust it. That means it's secure. We're gonna make this form feel great. We're gonna make it so it updates as you type, so you know whether you've put in the right stuff. It'll tell you exactly what you're missing with different messages. We'll try the disabled submit button to see if we like that. We'll add a loading spinner. Plus, we're gonna add some other, basic browser validation as well. So this is our site. This is ZDATE. This is a dating site that only allows people with a Z in their name. And we're starting out, like I said, with the Web 1.0 version. So up at the top, I added this you can click this pure HTML button. So we can go through each field. I'll click that. We can go through each field. Now fill it out. After we hit submit, we see the errors, right? So we just, this is kind of how the web used to work. We'd submit the form, it gives you back the errors, you can correct it, submit it again. If there's any more errors, one by one, we correct them. The fields here are the name, the social security number, the email, the password, and the confirm password. Okay, now each field, I have added a little heads up on the validation requirements. This is just text for now. So this matches the error message that you get with each at the bottom. So now, finally, when it's all set, we fill it out correctly, we submit it, and it goes through. Okay, now the submit does nothing because this is just a demo. I'm not trying to make this work right now. We're just showing the validation. So don't worry, it won't actually sign you up for any Z dating site if you're out demoing it. Okay, so now we're going to go back to the version with HTMX, which starts exactly the same as the pure HTML version. And the reason for this is that, and I did a video on HTMX application structure. And this is the reason. It's a good place to start is to start with no HTMX. Go as far as you can with no HTMX. And you're in a pretty good spot for building with HTMX. So you make the business logic and the basic HTML layout and the design. I'm actually using Base Coat UI here, by the way, which just released a CDN version. And is, a shad CN, but sort of for hypermedia stuff, you don't need React to use it. Okay, so we're going to get all the main stuff in place first, just like the HTML, and then we can assess where the HTMX can come in to help. And the answer here is that it's not a great user experience to keep hitting enter and going back and seeing what all the errors are and then filling it in. So we would much rather, and users nowadays would much rather get this kind of immediate feedback, right? So we want it to be fast. We want it to be accurate. That's very important for validation. We want it to be secure, right? They're putting in secure stuff. They're putting in passwords. They're putting in this case, social security numbers. So let's look at our existing code first. We have our main shell. Right? So then we can include that main registration form. That's going to be exactly the same. This is just an HTML form, the way it works right now with a regular submit, right? This goes to a post route to create, your account, which, like I said, it doesn't create it right now. The create checks for errors in the request with the request is valid function. So, this function is basically there to make sure that everything in there is all the stuff that came in, all the input from the user is valid. And we're going to put all the validation code in there. That way we can go through each field and create an errors array so that if anything doesn't pass, it goes into that errors array. This is a kind of, pretty standard way of doing this. Laravel actually has a built-in way to do this, which I'm not using because I want to just show kind of the low level, here's how you might do this. But that's a standard way to handle validation. You build up your array of errors if you want to, or you can just error out on the first one and give that back. But I like building up the array of errors because then you can show them everything that's wrong so they're not surprised each time they submit. Okay, so we have, we need our validated and verified social security number. We need a valid unique email. We need a valid unique password with special characters and a minimum length and a match and confirm. Okay, so I hope you're with me so far. We haven't touched HTMX yet. But if there's errors, we want to return that array of errors to the form, which outputs the errors with the red text at the bottom. So that's where we are now. Let's add the HTMX and make this way better. Okay, the first step is to add the HTMX CDN, right? And I just copy and paste that from hypecp.com. I'm already using Alpine.js CDN. I'm using that with the base coat UI, which actually now I think there's a version that doesn't need it, but at the time I recorded this, I'm using it. So the first step is just to submit the form using HTMX rather than just having a standard HTML submit. This means adding the hx post and hx-swap-outer HTML. So rather than having that method equals post, we just do hx post equals. We go to the same route as the action already was. Now the difference is what we return. So before, when you do a post, you're basically returning a new full page. Now we're going to return just the form partial, right? So instead of we've already isolated that form in our files. So now when we submit, it should just replace that form. But everything else is the same. So we can verify that in the network tab. So if I open up the network tab, we can have the same functionality essentially, but it's now going through the HTMX. So this gives us some immediate options for improvement. One of the issues with the current setup is that if it takes a long time, the user might click it twice, right? You've probably done that before. You submit a form. It's like, is this working? What's happening? If you don't get that immediate feedback to the user, then they might submit it twice, and that can cause problems if you haven't planned for that. And also, it's just not a good user experience. So what we can do, let's make it so the button is disabled after you click, right? So HTMX has a built-in way to do this. And this is the hx disabled element, ELT, equals button. So what you do is you add this to the whole form. As the request goes through this hx post, it will look at that CSS selector. In this case, I just did button because that's all we have that we want to disable. And it just disables that. So you can set any CSS selector you want to have the disabled attribute during the request. Okay, to see that that's actually working, let's add a sleep here for 3 seconds so that we can verify that it's working. Okay, so now after I submit, I wasn't able to click it. And you could see that it was disabled because base coat UI has added this nice little, a visual indicator that the button is disabled. Okay, let's try adding another little nicety and give it a loading spinner. So we can give it the special HTMX class. So basically we add this little loading spinner. This is a little GIF. And we are going to give it the special HTMX class, HTMX indicator. And this class there's a couple of these special classes. I won't go into them now. This is all I'm just going to do this, right? I'm not going to explain everything because there's lots of other videos to make where I explain stuff. Right now, I'm just creating stuff. Okay. HTMX indicator means that it will get opacity 1 during the request, and it gets opacity 0 not during the request, right? So I'm going to add this to the button, and I'm going to move the button text so that it stays centered. Okay, now we can see that it's clear to the user that this request is loading. That 3 seconds, you can see, okay, something's loading. Good. So we've added HTMX. We've made it already better, right? But we can do so much more. Okay. So let's make it so that the little validation phrases that show you what's done, right? So instead of just saying, here's what you should do, the must contain a Z will show up as red until it has a Z, right? That kind of makes sense. That's just something, you're kind of, as you go through the form, we want to show what's done and what's not. So this is our first need to really make any changes to our structure. So what we need is a way to submit the form and check for validation without submitting the form. So we need to check for that validation without actually having them click the button, right? So we need a new route that just checks the validation. It doesn't create a new, a new thing. It just checks for validation. So I'm going to keep it simple, and I'm just going to add one route, right? Instead of what we could do, htmx is low level. You've got a lot of options on how you structure stuff. What I'm going to do is try to keep it simple and just have one validate route instead of one for each field, which we could set up. Every time we make a change to this form, it's a small form, 5 fields, not a big deal, we will submit the whole form to that single validation route. Okay, so now we need to we'll create that route, and then we need to add that validate function to the controller. And it will be similar to the create, right? Because it's doing almost the same thing. It's taking in that form, seeing if it's valid, but rather than creating the account afterwards, it's just going to spit out the errors and tell you, okay, here's the errors, or maybe there's no errors, right? So whatever it does, it's something similar to that. Okay, so we don't need the sleep for this one. We can take the sleep out, and we already have our errors partial separated because that's just what we would do anyway, right? There's sort of a logical separation of, how you do your layout, where you don't necessarily want, or at least I don't necessarily want every single thing to be in one file, because I find it a little hard to things that are clearly delineated, like your list of errors, like your form. I think it makes sense already to have those separated into their own partials, and that makes it really easy to use htmx and then just take those partials and load them as needed. Okay, so our errors partial, though, right now it's just this list of red text. So that we need to needs to be completely rethought, right? So I wasn't originally planning to use hx-swap-oob for this validation setup. I was just going to return the whole HTML form every time, and that would, you could swap that out, which would be fine. But the problem with that is that the inputs, when we return a whole form every time, we're replacing the inputs in the DOM, which could give you the result of, you're typing. You've probably been on a website that does this, and what you just typed, you finished halfway, and then you get some new information from the server, and it replaces what you typed. I don't want to do that. I don't want to start getting into that, that function. So the plan here is to give every one of our little validation rules an ID and then update them as the user goes through them, right? So, the user makes a change to the input. We're going to update the ID of the validation rule that goes along with it. So htmx is low level. There's a lot of different ways to do this. But what I like about this is that we can use the exact same code for all these inputs. They're all doing the same thing. They are sending in the form and getting an array back of errors, but also HTML back, which is going to show them where the errors are, right? Okay, so it's even, it's the exact same errors array that we already use. We don't even need to change the way that we figure out in the validation rules what the errors are. All we're doing is we're changing how we display those errors, right? Okay, so let's add our IDs first. So we're going to give each the name of the field. So in this case, we have the name, we have the email, we have the social security number, we have create password, and we have confirm password. Okay, so let's start with the name. We need to make the input respond, right? So as you type. So we'll do an hx, actually I was going to say an hx get, but actually we'll do an hx post. And let's use the exact same route that we used for validate, right? So we'll just see what happens with the route and changing the trigger. Okay, so actually we need to use the special validation route that we created that returns just the errors. Okay, so we're putting all the errors where the input was, right? And that's not what we want because we haven't set any, this is just the way htmx works. If you don't specify a target or a way to swap it, it makes some assumptions. It has some defaults. So the default target is whatever input was the trigger. So in this case, the input itself. And the swap is by default inner HTML. So it's going to take that input and it's going to put into it all the errors that were just responded to. That's not what we want. Okay, so we'll do hx target equals none. So we're setting that so that it's not, having our target be the input. Oops, okay. Actually, we want hx-swap equals none. So hx target equals none doesn't exist. That you can't say none. That's a CSS selector that's supposed to go there. hx-swap equals none says whatever HTML you get back in this htmx request, ignore it. Just let it do nothing. Don't put it anywhere, right? Okay, so I'll explain why we're doing that in a minute. So now we can see that we're getting errors, right? But we're not putting them anywhere. So let's do two things. First, let's make it so that we can see the errors. Second, let's put our first one into the little validation rule ID here. So we have this little sentence up here that says what the validation rule should be. So we got to give our errors the same ID, like our response should use that same ID, and then set it to hx-swap-oob equals true, so that we can see that our errors list is updating live. Okay, so the hx-swap-oob, I've done a separate video on this, but basically what it does is it matches the IDs. So if you send back this HTML with this ID, it will find the same ID in your DOM, and it will replace out that HTML. Just swap it out with this. So, and out of OOB means out of band. So regardless of what your target was, so in this case, we didn't set a target. We just said hx-swap equals none, which means do nothing with that HTML. Don't put it anywhere. But the hx-swap-oob from what we're sending back is going to tell it, here's where we're going. It could be anywhere in your DOM. It doesn't have to be anywhere near the target. It just looks for that ID and it swaps it out. So now we can see that this little errors list at the bottom is updating live, right? So as I type the Z here, it removes the Z item from this list. Okay, so let's do the little text above, this little text right here. First, let's make sure that it's doing what we expect, which is just to make it red when we type and there's no Z. Because that says like, okay, you've started working on this field, but you have not gotten it correct. It's not validated yet. Okay, and we'll make it bold also. So now we need to do the logic to correctly change it based on the errors array, which we already have our errors array, which is nice. So first we just check to see if there is a name. So we're working on the name. If not, we set it back to its default color. So we just return the text as is. Okay, good. Now we need to check if there's a Z, right? So actually, we don't need to check. Like I said, our validation checks are already checking for the error. So we just need to see if we have already found that error. Okay, so let's see what that looks like again. Now we're going to look at that array. We can check to see if this is in our errors array, and we give it a green check if it's not in our array, right? Because this is our errors array. So if it's not in there, then we know that there was no error there, so we give it the green check. Okay, so let's see what that looks like again. And maybe we add a strike through too. Okay, so there we go. So we'll add a little strike through. This is the basic idea of what I want to do. We're already doing the hard work of the validation on the server, right? When you submitted the form, in just the plain HTML version, we're already doing that hard work. So let's not recreate that on the front end. We don't need to. We want to use all that same thing. And, also this is something I'll just pause for a minute here, but the front end is not secure. It's not a secure way to do validation because a malicious user, can just right click, inspect element, and make changes to your front end. They can make stuff that's required, unrequired. They can make the type of field or the wrong type of field. If you set the type of field to email or something like that, they can change it. So, you don't want to rely on your JavaScript, on your front end to do your validation. You just don't. You always have to do it on the server anyway. So why not reuse that? Okay. So we just want to reuse that array and check for errors, and all these other ones are going to basically look exactly the same. It's just a matter of checking it. But, each one has its own. So we'll do the Social Security next. So the things we require here are the right number of digits, right? And that it has to be verified with the United States government. So we'll use a fictional third-party service to verify the Social Security number. Now, we need to do similar logic and check if there are any errors set in the array. We'll start with our little 9 digits. So actually, we want to have each part of the rule work independently. But then the check itself only appears if everything works, right? So, as you're typing, you can have some things validated and some things not validated. Once everything's validated, that's when you get the green check mark. Okay, so I'm realizing that we're firing off a lot of requests as we type, right? And this is a concern for something called race conditions. So what if one of our requests, maybe the validation takes a long time, maybe there's just a network blip, whatever it is, what if it takes a long time? And so they come back out of order, your different validations. Then it could look like something is validated when it's not, or vice versa. It could look unvalidated even though it should be valid. So we want to make sure that we either throttle those requests. That's one way to kind of slow it down so that it's not just sending every single keystroke. But more importantly, we need to figure out how to make it handle multiple requests, because sometimes you want that speed of, you want to get the immediate requests in and you want to get stuff back as fast as possible. So you don't necessarily want to put a delay or a throttling or a debounce on the input. You might not want to do that. So you can use an htmx attribute called hx-sync. Right? And again, I'm not going to get into this fully, but basically it lets you set a default rule for how multiple htmx requests are sent. So in this case, we want a new request. We want every new request to completely obliterate and replace the previous requests, right? Because all that matters when you're dealing with validation is the most recent one. Okay, so this attribute, like a lot of htmx attributes, is inherited. So if you put it up here in the DOM, everything that's within that piece of DOM is also going to get that same thing. So what this hx-sync says is that in the form, it should replace all other current requests every time something is submitted. Anytime any request happens in here, it should replace all other requests, which is what we want. Okay, so let's look at the network tab now, and we can see that it is canceling out all the other ones as I type fast here. And this handles our kind of race conditions issue, where a slow network could cause things to come back in the wrong order. Okay, so let's continue with the email. So we copy the same input. It's the same validation route to the email input. And now we set the errors page to return the correct language, just like we did with name and with Social Security. So if there's no email, we just return the plain text. Again, if there's no errors at all, we return the check mark to show that the whole input is valid, right? So otherwise, we start to check each one. So first we check the format, which is just checking a simple regex for emails. I don't even know if it does use regex. I think we have a built-in PHP validate email. Okay, so then we have to check whether the email is unique. So this involves actually checking the users in the database. And if it finds a user that's already in there, then we can send a little message saying like, you already have an account, or you have to use a unique email or something like that. All right, so let's do the password next. So once again, we add the input to do the same validation code, which is, the same htmx input here. We send it to the same place, the same route. We're doing the same thing for all inputs here. We use the same, of course, we don't have to. We could mix this up. We could give each input its own unique thing if we wanted to. That's the flexibility of this. But for simplicity's sake, we're just going to use the same one. And we already have the validation code written. But let's take a quick look at what that is, since this one has more parts than the other ones, this new password. So, first of all, we have to make sure that the password is unique. We just check all the other users and check their passwords to see if any of them match. Then we check the length to see, make sure it's 7 or more characters. And then we do a regex to make sure that the password, has one of the special characters. So that's just kind of, standard password verification there. Okay. Now, the first thing we do is check to see if it's empty. So we just return the regular text for that field. If they haven't done anything, if they've left it empty, we just return nothing, nothing changes. So if there's no errors, then we can, basically if they've put this field in, this create password, and there's no errors, then we know it's complete. So then we add the check mark, little green check mark saying it's complete. So now we can see that each is working. For example, if I add a duplicate password, it gives me a handy reminder that I may have typed the wrong email address. So it shows me right down here, here's the email address that's associated with that duplicate password you just put in, right? So I may already have an account as a user. And the last field here, okay, so once that's all set, once you have your create password in place, the last field here is the confirm password. This is a simple, just required. And then of course it has to match your created password. So that's an easy check. Okay, now we can run through every field and just kind of go through. So we're getting, and now we have every field checked off, right? So this is better. Now, if we ruin it, if we change one of these things, it will let us know. It'll show up in the red. So the one thing that we've lost by making this a little more dynamic, a little more interactive, is in the original HTML, you could submit the form and see all the errors at the bottom, right? Which now when you submit the form, you don't get any feedback. And in fact, when you submit the form, it kind of clears it all out. So your information's still there, but your validation is not sort of live, not showing you what's happened. Okay, so what it should do is it should show us the errors list at the bottom when we submit too, and our little errors, along the way in our sentences. So we changed the way it worked, so it's not doing that now. So if we return the form with the errors, which is what we're doing, but we're not putting those into the page anymore, right? So we've sort of separated those things out. It's not just drawing those and putting them into the page. We have this, we're using hx-swap-oob, and we're putting them into specific IDs now. We have our own route that handles the errors. So that's fine, but let's add something here so that when we reload, when we submit and it draws that again, it also then brings back our validation. Okay, so what we can do is we can take our errors div here where we've putting our errors, and we can set up a post to the same validation route that we've been using for all the inputs. But now we trigger that when the page loads. So when that's added to the screen, if it needs to, it will trigger it, and we're going to use the hx-swap equals none again, because we're just doing the same thing that we would do for a validation. We're basically just triggering that same validation again. And every one of those fields has the hx-swap-oob on the server that's telling the HTML where to go. So now we can see when we submit, it clears out for a second. And remember, we have that 3-second sleep on the submit. It's not actually slow. We added that ourselves. Okay, and then it loads the validation again. So we could have the server just return that, so there's no blip, right? We could add it so that when it draws our form again, it also checks the errors and draws what it needs to. But I just, for the simplicity's sake, I don't think it's a problem to have it when you submit, to have it blip for a second and then come back with your new validation errors. That all seems fine to me. So we keep it working all just one way, just triggered from different places, but let's just keep that working the way it does. Okay. Now, the one thing we could do is, to sort of avoid that, is we have our validation. We know whether it's a good input. So why not just block the user from submitting until they get the validation right? Why even let them submit, right? So here's how that might work. And I'll mention that I don't like doing this in a minute, but here's how that would work. So we go back to our error validation file. We take that original button from the form, and let's give it an ID first of all. So now we have 2 buttons, right? So we're going to take that one, duplicate it, and we have this if statement here, right, that separates it. So one of these is if there's no validation errors. So everything's fine, ready to submit. we add the disabled otherwise. So if there are any validation errors, we add this disabled to it. So now we can see that only once everything is there and validated can we submit, right? Now, do I like that? I don't like that. Even though there's sort of a logic to it and it kind of logically makes sense. What if there's something wrong with your validation code? And you probably have at some point, not necessarily the validation part itself, but the network or some typo in your unrelated to the problem at hand. The problem at hand is you want your user to be able to create an account, right? So if you have some error that disables their button to submit, even though all their stuff is valid, and they cannot submit, like that's got to be one of the most frustrating things in the world. So I think it's fine to just have the submit button. As long as it's all following the same validation rules, it'll get kicked back to the user. It'll tell them what's wrong. Maybe there was some other error along the way. You don't want to have these little errors that are meaningless front end, UI niceties block your user from doing the work they need to do. So I'm just going to disable it and, leave it the way it is. Okay, so that's it for now. That is just one way to do form validation with HTMX. It's not the only way. There's only one sort of really simple thing I would add to all of this is that the browser HTML, you can just like throw on the simple HTML built-in things like requires, right? Which is going to solve like a lot of your problems. If someone wants to get around them and take off, right click, inspect element, take off the required, they can submit the form even though it's not required. You're already handling that case. So just throwing these extra little things onto the inputs, these required, the browser HTML things, super easy. You can also do like regex stuff and if you want to with the browser stuff. But just adding the requires. So the last thing I actually want to do is to just remove our long list of errors. Because we're treating each one with these little sentences, I don't think we need the list of errors at the bottom. And the button disabling, I don't think I want that. Just enable the button, let them click it. It'll return the errors. Then we're good. Okay, so that's it. We're done. We have our 100% HTMX form validation. In accordance with the laws in the state of Massachusetts and my personal attorney, I have prepared a special statement regarding this video. Although my goal has been to instruct and demonstrate, it is now clear that in my haste I have made several crucial mistakes. The most egregious are the 4 specific privacy violations that together suggest a blatant disregard for user confidentiality on behalf of hypermedia-tv. First, the Social Security requirement. No online registration form should require a Social Security number, as shown in the video at a 5-minute mark. Public Social Security number lookup. Returning a legal name for an existing Social Security number is a clear violation of public record laws. It should be noted that this functionality at the 20-minute mark, only Social Security number lookup. Password matching. No user-facing site should ever search the password field for matches. As shown at the 24-minute and 30-second mark, passwords should always be used in tandem with the username or password lookup. Perhaps the most egregious, returning the email of the matched password allows users to log in as another user. I disavow this pattern and encourage viewers to skip past this part of the video at the 25-minute, 20-second mark. Each of these 4 patterns would in production represent gross violations of user trust. Furthermore, the product of ZDATE itself, a fictional dating site, is for demonstration purposes only. This site is not live. Even its existence is potentially discriminatory, as it could be interpreted pursuant to the lower court ruling of the state of New Jersey versus Michael Gorczyk to favor or target people of Polish descent. Absolutely nothing I say in any of my videos should be construed as professional advice of any kind.